Lucas tightened his grip on the steering wheel as his taxi coasted through the dimly lit streets, his mind a restless swirl of worries. The day's earnings, counted down to the last coin, fell painfully short of what he needed to make ends meet. His 10-year-old son, Sam, was waiting at home, likely asleep by now, curled up on the threadbare couch that had become his makeshift bed ever since the furniture had to be sold. Memories of Lucas's late wife hovered in his mind like a persistent shadow, a blend of comfort and ache. She had been the glue holding their little family together, and now he often felt like he was grasping at shards. He glanced at the dashboard clock, 10:47 p.m. Just a few more rides, he thought, though his body ached for rest. The drizzle outside blurred the city's amber streetlights into smudged halos, adding to the gloom. The sharp chime of his dispatcher broke the monotony. Pickup request, 12th and Pine. Passenger's name is Victor. Lucas sighed and tapped the confirmation button. He steered toward the location, the familiar routine offering a brief respite from the weight on his chest. Pulling up to the curb, he scanned the sidewalk. Under the dim glow of a streetlight stood an elderly man, frail and hunched as though burdened by unseen weights. He held a small, weathered diary in one hand, his knuckles white from the pressure of his grip. Lucas rolled down the window slightly. "Victor?" he called out, his voice polite but flat from exhaustion. The man gave a slow nod, his movements stiff. He opened the door and slid into the back seat without a word. As the door shut, a faint smell of old leather and faint cologne filled the cabin. "Where to?" Lucas asked, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. Victor handed over a crumpled piece of paper with an address scribbled on it. His lips moved as though forming words, but no sound came. Lucas took the paper, nodded, and input the destination into his GPS. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers and the hum of the engine. From the corner of his eye, Lucas studied the man. Victor stared out the window, his expression distant, eyes reflecting a sorrow that felt almost palpable. His grip on the diary never loosened, his thumb occasionally stroking its cracked spine as if for reassurance. Lucas's curiosity stirred, though he suppressed the urge to ask. Experience had taught him that some passengers wanted nothing more than silence. Yet, the tension in the air was almost suffocating, and he felt compelled to say something. "Rough night?" he ventured, keeping his tone light. Victor didn't respond immediately. His shoulders rose slightly as if he'd taken a deep breath, but his gaze remained fixed on the rain-speckled glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hoarse, like someone who hadn't used it much lately. "You could say that," Victor murmured. His fingers tightened around the diary, drawing Lucas's attention to it. Lucas nodded, unsure how to respond. The man's pain was evident, but it wasn't his place to pry. Instead, he refocused on the road, letting the silence settle again. Minutes passed. Then, in the rearview mirror, Lucas caught a glimpse of Victor opening the diary. The pages looked fragile, yellowed with age, and filled with handwriting that seemed to tremble even on paper. Victor's hands trembled too as he turned the pages, his eyes scanning them with an intensity that bordered on desperation. At one point, a tear slipped down his cheek, quickly wiped away as though it were an unwanted guest. Lucas's stomach twisted at the sight. He didn't know this man, didn't know his story, but he recognized the weight of grief. It mirrored his own. He wanted to offer words of comfort, but the right ones wouldn't come. Instead, he adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, giving Victor the privacy to grieve. They reached a red light, and Lucas glanced again at the diary. One of the pages caught the faint glow of the streetlight, revealing a sketch of a woman's face. It was delicate, almost lifelike, drawn with a tenderness that made Lucas's throat tighten. Victor's fingers traced the outline of the drawing, and for a fleeting moment, his expression softened into something unrecognizable, longing, perhaps, or regret. The light turned green. Lucas refocused on the road, his mind churning with unspoken questions. Who is she? Boyf? A daughter? He bit his tongue, knowing better than to intrude. The journey continued in heavy silence until they neared the destination. Victor straightened slightly, his demeanor shifting as though bracing himself for something. He closed the diary with care, clutching it tightly against his chest as if it were the only thing anchoring him. Lucas pulled up to the address, a modest, aging building that seemed as weary as its occupant. He parked and turned to face Victor. "Here we are," he said quietly. Victor nodded and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills. His hands shook as he passed them forward. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "No problem," Lucas replied, taking the money but feeling a pang of guilt for doing so. "Take care of yourself." Victor paused as if wanting to say more, but instead he opened the door and stepped out into the drizzle. He stood there for a moment, the rain soaking his thin frame, before shuffling toward the building. Lucas watched him go, a deep unease settling over him. The sight of Victor's hunched figure disappearing into the shadows left him with a hollow feeling, a nagging sense that the man carried more than his share of sorrow. As the door closed behind Victor, Lucas sighed and adjusted the rearview mirror, preparing for the next ride. The rain continued to fall, drumming against the car like a heartbeat. Lucas couldn't shake the image of Victor clutching that diary, its secrets now etched into his own thoughts. The cab interior felt suffocating, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the soft patter of rain against the windows. Lucas's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he navigated the slick streets, his peripheral vision occasionally catching glimpses of the passenger in the back seat. Victor sat rigid, clutching the diary like a lifeline. His face remained turned toward the window, where streaks of water obscured the faint glow of streetlights. Lucas tried to focus on the road, but a sound drew his attention. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, a shaky breath, a faint sniffle. Then it became unmistakable, quiet sobs, barely audible but raw with emotion. Lucas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was no stranger to passengers with burdens, but the palpable weight of this man's grief unnerved him. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Victor flipping through the pages of the worn diary, his trembling fingers brushing over the paper as if the act might bring him solace. Whatever memories those pages held seemed to unravel him further. His shoulders sagged, and his breath hitched with each turn of a page. Lucas hesitated before speaking. He wasn't good with words, especially in moments like these, but the silence felt unbearable. Reaching into the cup holder, he grabbed an unopened bottle of water and extended it backward. "Here," Lucas said, keeping his voice low and calm. "It might help." Victor paused, his hand frozen mid-turn of a page. For a moment, Lucas thought he might refuse, but then the older man reached out and took the bottle, his fingers brushing Lucas's briefly. "Thank you," Victor murmured, his voice hoarse and strained. He placed the bottle on the seat beside him without opening it, his focus drifting back to the diary. Lucas exhaled slowly and turned the radio dial, landing on a station playing soft instrumental music. The gentle piano notes filled the car, blending with the rain in a way that felt almost soothing. He hoped it would ease the tension, though he knew music couldn't mend whatever had broken Victor. Minutes stretched into an eternity as the cab weaved through the city. Lucas couldn't help but glance occasionally at the mirror, catching fleeting images of Victor's face, his sunken eyes, the deep lines of sorrow etched into his features. The man looked like he carried a lifetime of regrets, each one heavier than the last. Victor's sobs subsided into shallow breaths, though his body remained taut with unease. Lucas could feel the man's struggle, his attempt to keep himself together in the presence of a stranger. It was a kind of humiliation Lucas understood too well. Grief, when shared unwillingly, often felt like an exposure of the soul, a vulnerability that stung deeper than any insult. The destination loomed closer. Lucas's jeepus chimed softly, breaking the spell of silence. Victor closed the diary carefully, pressing it to his chest as though shielding it from the world. As Lucas pulled up to the address, Victor reached into his pocket, fumbling with his wallet. His hands were shaking again, a tremor that seemed to spread through his entire frame. He handed Lucas several bills, more than the fare required. "Keep the change," Victor said quietly, his voice flat but thick with something unspoken. Lucas's fingers brushed the money as he accepted it, a pang of guilt gnawing at him. The tip was generous, almost too generous, but he knew better than to refuse. "Thank you," he said softly, unsure if Victor even heard him. Victor opened the door and stepped into the rain, his fragile figure illuminated briefly by the cab's interior light. Lucas watched as he shuffled toward the building, the diary still clutched tightly in his grasp. He didn't look back, disappearing into the shadows without another word. Lucas sighed and prepared to pull away, but as he glanced at the back seat in the rearview mirror, his breath caught. There, nestled in the corner of the seat, was the diary. Its worn leather cover gleamed faintly in the dim light, a stark reminder of the man who had just left. For a moment, Lucas didn't move. His mind raced with questions. Should he go back and return it? Would Victor even want to see him again after such a vulnerable moment? His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, the urge to leave warring with the weight of responsibility. The rain continued its relentless rhythm as Lucas reached back and grabbed the diary, its weight heavier than he expected. He opened it tentatively, the scent of aged paper wafting up to meet him. The first page held a sketch of a woman, delicate and precise, as though drawn with infinite care. Beneath the sketch, a name was scrawled in elegant handwriting, Evelyn. Lucas's chest tightened as he flipped through a few more pages, finding snippets of poetry and letters written in the same hand. Each word radiated love, loss, and longing. This wasn't just a diary, it was a repository of someone's heart. Guilt gnawed at Lucas for prying, but the thought of leaving the diary behind felt worse. He closed it gently and placed it on the passenger seat. As he pulled away from the curb, his mind churned with unease. He couldn't shake the image of Victor's hunched shoulders, nor the tears that had fallen silently in the back seat. Lucas didn't know what he would do with the diary or how he would find the man again. But one thing was clear. This small, worn book carried a story that deserved to be told, even if only to the one who had forgotten it. Lucas parked his taxi in the dim glow of a street lamp, the rhythmic patter of rain against the windshield a relentless backdrop to the storm in his mind. His hands rested on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the worn leather diary sitting on the passenger seat. His conscience wavered. It wasn't his to open, but something about the sorrow etched into Victor's face during the ride and the man's trembling sobs made it impossible to simply ignore. With a hesitant breath, Lucas reached for the diary. The leather was soft and aged, the edges frayed from years of handling. His fingers hovered over the cover before finally flipping it open. The first page revealed a sketch of a woman's face, her expression serene yet hauntingly distant. Beneath it, the name Evelyn was scrawled in careful cursive. Lucas's chest tightened. The drawing seemed to exude a love so profound it left an ache in its wake. The next pages held photographs. Lucas's hands shook as he turned each one over. They depicted a younger Victor with a beautiful woman, her arms draped around him as they laughed together. Another showed Victor with two children, a boy and a girl, grinning at the camera as they sat on their father's shoulders. The joy in these moments was unmistakable, but Lucas couldn't help noticing the faint wear and tear on the photos, as though they had been touched and cried over countless times. As he delved deeper into the diary, the entries shifted from vivid descriptions of family life to darker musings. Victor's words, penned in shaky handwriting, painted a picture of profound loss. Mentions of Evelyn became sparse, then stopped altogether. Lucas didn't need the details to understand. The void her absence left was palpable. The later pages chronicled Victor's growing isolation, his estrangement from his children, and his mounting despair. Lucas's stomach turned as he reached the final entry, written in a desperate scrawl. "Tomorrow it ends. This is my only way out." The weight of the words hit Lucas like a physical blow, his breath catching in his throat. He stared at the page, his mind racing. Was Victor planning to end his life? The thought sent a shiver through him. The man's quiet sorrow during the ride, the way he clutched the diary as though it were his last tether to this world, it all began to make sense. Lucas slammed the diary shut, his pulse pounding in his ears. For a moment he sat frozen, the rain outside feeling heavier, more oppressive. Victor's face flashed in his mind, that fragile, haunted expression, and Lucas knew he couldn't ignore this. He grabbed his phone, fumbling with the buttons as his damp hands made it difficult to type. Searching through his ride logs, he found the address where he had dropped Victor off. His thumb hovered over the call button to alert emergency services but paused. What would he even say? That an elderly man had forgotten a diary with a cryptic note? What if it was too late by the time anyone responded? Lucas clenched his jaw and threw the diary onto the passenger seat. His decision was made. He had to find Victor himself. The drive back to Victor's address was agonizing, every red light and slow car feeling like a deliberate delay. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if Victor had already acted on his plan? What if he arrived too late? The humiliation of prying into another man's personal thoughts burned in the back of his mind, but it was overshadowed by the urgency of the situation. When Lucas finally pulled up to the building, he killed the engine and grabbed the diary. The rain had eased into a steady drizzle, but the air was still heavy with the scent of damp concrete. He hurried to the door and scanned the buzzers. Victor's name wasn't listed, and Lucas cursed under his breath. He pressed random buttons, hoping someone would let him in. After what felt like an eternity, a crackling voice came through the intercom. "Yeah, I'm here to see Victor." "It's urgent," Lucas blurted, his voice trembling. He half expected the person to hang up, but the door buzzed open. Lucas took the stairs 2 at a time, his breath shallow as he reached the 3rd floor. He didn't know which apartment was Victor's but noticed a faint light spilling from beneath one of the doors. He knocked hard, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. "Victor?" he called out, his voice edged with desperation. There was no response. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Fear tightened his chest as he reached for the doorknob. It turned easily, it wasn't locked. Lucas hesitated, the weight of intruding into someone's home gnawing at him, but the thought of what might be happening inside propelled him forward. The apartment was dim, the air thick with a musty scent. Victor sat slumped in a chair by the window, his silhouette illuminated by the flickering glow of a street lamp outside. The diary was conspicuously absent from his grasp. His head hung low, and for one heart-stopping moment, Lucas feared the worst. "Victor?" Lucas called, rushing forward. The man stirred slightly, lifting his head with great effort. His eyes, red and glassy, met Lucas's with a mix of confusion and exhaustion. "What are you doing here?" Victor mumbled, his voice barely audible. Lucas exhaled a shaky breath, relief washing over him like a tidal wave. "You left this in my cab," he said, holding up the diary. His voice was steadier now, but the urgency hadn't left it. "I read it. I know I shouldn't have, but I had to. I saw the last page." Victor's expression darkened, shame flickering across his face. He looked away, his hands clenching the arms of the chair. "You should have left it alone." "I couldn't," Lucas replied, his tone firm but not unkind. "Whatever you're going through, you don't have to face it alone. There's another way. There's always another way." Victor let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything. To look back and see nothing but failure." Lucas knelt beside him, meeting his gaze. "I do. I lost my wife. I'm raising my son alone. Every day feels like a fight I'm losing. But I'm still here. And so are you." His voice cracked as he spoke, raw emotion spilling out. "Please, Victor. Don't give up." Victor's face crumpled, tears streaming down his cheeks. For the first time, he let himself cry openly, the weight of his pain spilling out in ragged sobs. Lucas stayed by his side, silent but steady, offering the one thing Victor hadn't felt in years, a connection. Lucas drove like a man possessed, his heart pounding against his ribs as he navigated the rain-slicked streets. The diary rested on the passenger seat, the words he'd read etched into his mind. He cursed himself for not noticing Victor's pain earlier, for letting the man walk away into the night with no intervention. The memory of the final entry haunted him. "Tomorrow it ends." Every passing second felt like a potential goodbye he couldn't bear to let happen. When he finally reached the park, he threw the car into park and stepped out into the cold drizzle. The sparse glow of distant streetlights made it difficult to see, but Lucas's eyes scanned desperately, searching for any sign of the elderly man. The park was nearly empty, save for the faint outlines of benches and the whisper of leaves stirred by the wind. Then there he was, Victor. He sat hunched on a bench near the park's edge, the same one Lucas had dropped him off at earlier. The man's silhouette looked fragile, his head bowed and his hands clasped tightly together. The sight made Lucas's breath catch in his throat. For a moment, he hesitated, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he was about to say. What if he made it worse? What if Victor refused to listen? But the thought of doing nothing was unbearable. Lucas grabbed the diary and strode forward, his shoes squelching against the wet pavement. "Victor," Lucas called softly as he approached, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. The older man stirred slightly, his shoulders tensing at the sound of his name. He turned his head just enough to glance at Lucas, his eyes weary and glazed. There was no recognition at first, just a faint flicker of confusion. "I found this," Lucas said, holding up the diary. "You left it in my cab." Victor's expression shifted, a mixture of surprise and dread. His gaze dropped to the diary in Lucas's hand, and his lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Lucas took the empty space beside him on the bench, setting the diary gently between them. "I read it," Lucas admitted, his voice low. "I know I shouldn't have, but I saw what you wrote. About tomorrow." Victor stiffened, his face flushing with a mix of humiliation and anger. "You had no right." "You're right," Lucas cut him off gently but firmly. "I didn't. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't just let you." His words faltered, the weight of them catching in his throat. "You don't deserve to go through this alone." Victor let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "What would you know about it? You don't know what it's like to lose everything. To look back and see a lifetime of mistakes staring you in the face." Lucas looked at him, his own pain rising to the surface. "I do," he said quietly. "I lost my wife, Victor. She was my everything. And when she was gone, I didn't know how to keep going. I felt like the world had turned its back on me. I even thought about leaving it all behind, just giving up. The only reason I didn't was my son. He needed me, and I realized I couldn't fail him, no matter how broken I felt." Victor's gaze finally met Lucas's, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the younger man's face. Lucas continued, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "It wasn't easy," Lucas admitted. "Some days I didn't think I'd make it. I'd look at my son and wonder how I could possibly give him the life he deserved when I felt so empty. But every day I got up and I tried. And slowly things got better, not perfect but better." Victor's shoulders slumped, his anger draining away as quickly as it had come. He rubbed his hands together, his expression clouded with regret. "I had a family once," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A wife, 2 kids. They were my whole world. But I let them down. I let my work, my pride, get in the way. Now they won't even speak to me." Lucas leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Do they know how you feel? Have you tried reaching out?" Victor shook his head, his hands trembling. "What's the point? They've moved on. They don't need me." "You don't know that," Lucas said firmly. "You're assuming they've closed the door, but maybe they're just waiting for you to knock. Maybe they're just as scared as you are." Victor looked at him, his face etched with uncertainty. Lucas reached for the diary and held it out to him. "This," Lucas said, gesturing to the book, "this is proof of how much you care. The memories, the love, it's all here. They need to know that, Victor. They need to know you haven't forgotten." Victor hesitated before taking the diary, his fingers brushing over the worn leather as though it were a sacred artifact. He stared at it for a long moment, his eyes filling with tears. "What if they don't forgive me?" he whispered. "Then you'll know you tried," Lucas said, his voice soft but resolute. "But you'll also know that love is worth the risk. It's never too late to make amends." The 2 men sat in silence, the rain continuing to fall in gentle whispers around them. Finally, Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out a scrap of paper. He scribbled down his number and handed it to Victor. "Call me," Lucas said. "Anytime, for any reason." "I mean it." Victor stared at the number, then looked back at Lucas. His lips trembled as he spoke. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Lucas offered a faint, weary smile. "Because someone once told me that no one should face their struggles alone. And they were right." Victor nodded, his tears mingling with the rain as he clutched the diary and the scrap of paper close to his chest. Lucas stood, placing a steady hand on Victor's shoulder before turning to leave. As he walked away, he glanced back one last time to see Victor sitting upright, the faintest glimmer of hope returning to his weary frame. The rain began to let up as Lucas reached his cab, the weight on his chest a little lighter. Whatever happened next, he knew he had done what he could. Sometimes, he thought, all it took to change a life was a moment of kindness and the courage to reach out. Lucas was jolted awake by the shrill ring of his phone. Dawn light seeped through the thin curtains of his cramped apartment, casting pale shadows on the walls. He reached for the phone, groggy and disoriented, until the unfamiliar name flashing on the screen cleared the fog in his mind. Sophia. His heart skipped. Victor's diary had mentioned a daughter by that name. "Hello." Lucas answered hesitantly, sitting up in bed. "Is this Lucas?" The voice on the other end was calm but tinged with emotion. "My name is Sophia." "Victor's daughter?" Lucas froze, his thoughts racing. "Yes, this is Lucas. Is everything all right?" There was a brief pause, and then Sophia's voice returned, firmer now. "I just wanted to thank you. My father called me this morning. It's been years since we last spoke. He said you helped him find the courage to reach out. I don't know what you told him, but I think it saved his life." Lucas exhaled slowly, the weight of the previous night still pressing on his chest. "I just gave him a little nudge," he said modestly. "How is he?" "He's with us now, me and my brother, Michael," Sophia replied. Her voice softened, and Lucas could hear a mix of relief and trepidation. "He asked to meet us at the park. We're here now, trying to talk through everything. He's so different from the man I remember." Lucas leaned back against the headboard, feeling the gravity of her words. "I'm glad he reached out. I was worried he wouldn't. Would you come?" Sophia asked suddenly, her tone urgent. "To the park? He told us about you, how you found him and convinced him not to give up. I think he wants you to be part of this. And honestly, we want to thank you in person." Lucas hesitated, a swirl of emotions knotting in his stomach. "Of course," he said after a moment. "I'll be there soon." The park was bathed in the soft hues of early morning. The rain from the previous night had left a sheen on the pavement and a crispness in the air. Lucas parked his cab and stepped out, spotting the same bench where he had found Victor just hours ago. This time, the scene was different. Victor sat upright, his face showing a mixture of vulnerability and hope, with Sophia and Michael flanking him. Sophia was in her early 30s, her features bearing a faint resemblance to her father's. She carried herself with a quiet strength, though her eyes were red-rimmed, betraying the emotions of their reunion. Michael, younger and sturdier, had his arms crossed, his posture defensive but his expression softening as he listened to Victor speak. As Lucas approached, Victor's gaze lifted, and their eyes met. There was a depth in Victor's look, a mixture of gratitude and humility that made Lucas's throat tighten. "You came," Victor said quietly, standing to greet him. "Of course," Lucas replied, shaking the older man's hand. "How are you feeling?" Victor let out a heavy sigh. "Relieved. But more alive than I've felt in years." Sophia stood and extended her hand to Lucas. "Thank you," she said earnestly, her grip firm. "I don't think we'd be here if it weren't for you." Michael followed suit, his handshake a little rougher but no less sincere. "Yeah," he added gruffly. "I don't know what you said to him, but whatever it was, it worked." Lucas felt a flush of discomfort under their praise. "He did the hard part," he said. "I just helped him see what was already there." Victor gestured for Lucas to sit, and the four of them settled onto the bench. Victor's hands rested on the diary in his lap, the leather cover now looking less like a burden and more like a bridge. "I told them about everything," Victor began, his voice trembling slightly. "About how I failed them, how I let my pride get in the way for so many years, and about what almost happened last night." Sophia reached out, placing a hand on her father's arm. "You didn't just fail us, Dad," she said gently. "We failed you too. We didn't know how much you were struggling. We were angry, and we let that anger keep us apart for too long." Michael nodded, his expression softening further. "I won't lie, Dad. It's not going to be easy, but I want to try. For all of us." Victor's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded wordlessly, his grip on the diary tightening. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. but I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Lucas felt a lump form in his throat as he witnessed the raw honesty between them. He remembered his own struggles to stay connected to his son, how easy it was for love to get lost under the weight of life's hardships. Sophia turned to Lucas. It means so much to us that you didn't just look the other way. You saw my father when no one else did, and you gave him a chance to come back to us. Lucas shook his head, humbled by her words. Sometimes all someone needs is to know they're not invisible. Victor's the one who made the choice to reach out. That takes real courage. Victor wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, his voice steadier now. It's more than that, Lucas. You didn't just give me courage, you gave me hope. And I don't know if I can ever repay you for that. You don't need to, Lucas replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another scrap of paper, scribbling down his phone number again. Handing it to Victor, he said, "Just promise me one thing. Don't let this be the last time you call your kids. And if you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me." Victor took the number with a nod, his expression earnest. "I promise." The four of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the morning's events settling around them. The sun had risen higher now, casting a warm light over the park and chasing away the chill. For the first time in what felt like years, Victor smiled. A real, unguarded smile. As Lucas stood to leave, Sophia and Michael both thanked him again, their gratitude clear in their voices. Victor rose too, shaking Lucas's hand firmly and holding it for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. Lucas nodded, his chest heavy but in a good way. As he walked back to his cab, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. Victor, Sophia, and Michael remained on the bench, their conversation continuing as the morning's sun illuminated their faces. Lucas climbed into his cab, his thoughts drifting to Sam, still asleep at home. He started the engine, ready to head back to his son, feeling lighter than he had in years. Life wasn't perfect, but moments like these made the struggle worthwhile. Victor stood near the edge of the park, the morning sun catching the streaks of gray in his hair. His children, Sophia and Michael, flanked him, their expressions a mix of gratitude and lingering emotion. Lucas prepared to leave, his cab waiting nearby, but Victor took a step closer, his trembling hand extended. "Lucas," Victor began, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you my life. If you hadn't stepped in last night, if you hadn't taken the time to care," his words faltered, and he drew a shaky breath. "I don't know where I'd be right now. And I certainly wouldn't be here, with my family, feeling like I've been given a second chance." Lucas shook his head, his gaze steady. "You did the hard part, Victor. You found the strength to reach out, to face them after so long. That's not easy." Victor gripped Lucas's hand firmly, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You gave me that strength. You saw something in me when I couldn't see it in myself. That's a debt I can never repay." Sophia stepped forward, her face softening. "You didn't just help our father, Lucas. You helped us too. It's been years since we've seen him like this, hopeful, determined to make things right. That's because of you." Michael nodded, his voice quieter but no less sincere. "Yeah. I was ready to write him off completely, but last night changed everything. You gave us a chance to be a family again." Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat. He wasn't used to this kind of praise, and he struggled to find the right words. "I just wanted to help," he said finally. "That's all." Victor took a deep breath, his expression shifting to one of resolution. "Then let me do something for you in return. Something that will make a difference for you and your son." Lucas tilted his head, confused. "Victor, you don't have to do anything. Seeing you reconnect with your family is more than enough." Victor shook his head firmly, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small set of keys. He held them out to Lucas, the metal glinting in the sunlight. "This is for you," he said, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "These are the keys to my old family home. I haven't lived there in years. It's been empty ever since everything fell apart." Lucas stared at the keys, his brow furrowing. "Victor, I can't accept this. That's your home. Your family's memories are there." Victor's lips pressed into a thin line, and he glanced at Sophia and Michael, who both nodded in quiet support. "That house has only brought me pain," he admitted. It's a constant reminder of what I lost. But it doesn't have to be that way for you. I want it to be a fresh start, for you and your son. A place where new memories can be made. Lucas hesitated, his hand hovering near the keys. Victor, this is too much. I don't even know what to say. Say yes, Victor urged, his tone soft but insistent. Please. Let me do this. I've spent years holding on to that house, thinking it was all I had left of my family. But now I see that what matters most isn't a building, it's the people you choose to hold on to. I'm holding on to them, he said, gesturing toward Sophia and Michael. And I want you to have this. Lucas finally took the keys, his fingers brushing against Victor's trembling hand. His voice was thick with emotion as he said, Thank you. I don't know if I deserve this, but I promise I'll make it a home. Victor smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. You already do. A week later, Lucas and his son, Sam, stood in front of the house. It was modest but sturdy, with a red brick exterior and a porch that wrapped around the front. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the paint on the shutters was peeling, but Lucas could see the potential. Sam clung to his side, his wide eyes taking in the space. Is this really ours? Sam asked, his voice filled with a mix of disbelief and excitement. It is, Lucas replied, his voice steady despite the swirl of emotions inside him. It's our new home. Sam broke into a grin, racing up the steps to explore the porch. Lucas followed, unlocking the door and stepping inside. The air smelled faintly of dust and age, but the interior was warm and inviting, with hardwood floors and sunlight streaming through the windows. Can I pick my room? Sam asked eagerly, his eyes already darting toward the staircase. Go ahead, Lucas said with a chuckle. He watched his son bound up the stairs, his laughter echoing through the empty house. For the first time in years, Lucas felt a flicker of hope. This house wasn't just a structure, it was a chance to rebuild their lives, to create a place where they could heal and grow together. As Lucas began unpacking, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Victor, Sophia, and Michael standing on the porch, each carrying a box. We figured you could use some help, Sophia said with a smile. Victor stepped forward, his expression earnest. This isn't just a gift, Lucas. It's a beginning, for all of us. We're here for you, just like you were there for me. Over the next hours, the two families worked together, unpacking boxes, cleaning, and sharing stories. Laughter filled the house, a stark contrast to the silence that had once dominated its walls. Sam bonded quickly with Sophia and Michael, their easy camaraderie a testament to the connection that had formed between the families. By evening, the house felt alive again, the warmth of friendship and newfound hope radiating from every corner. As they sat together around the kitchen table, sharing a simple meal, Victor raised his glass. To second chances, he said, his voice strong and clear. And to the people who remind us that it's never too late to make things right? Lucas nodded, his heart full. To second chances, he echoed, his gaze sweeping over the faces around the table. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't just surviving, he was living.